and welcome back to V-Road, CCTCG's weekly Vanguard podcast. I'm Cole.
And I'm Trey.
And today we've got a little bit more of a free-form topic. It was something I was reminded of pretty recently, but it has to do with the new player experience in Vanguard. And I think it's both the best and maybe the kind of most complicated it's been in a pretty long time. There's like really good beginner product now for multiple formats, and really good sets that have come out recently that can support those products that kind of make it kind of give a new player like a really clear avenue to building a fairly unique deck. So what do you feel about?
Yeah, I mean, with just talking about standard here first, them releasing 6 brand new additional starter decks is what they're calling them, not trial decks. It kind of adds in a little bit of a play style from everything, and we've touched on this in previous videos as well, but it's kind of nice that they touch a little bit into like kind of what like the main trope is inside of those nations. Like Sarvacel, you kind of call from drop, and like that's the big thing with like Rezael now, and a lot of like Luard, you recuperate cards from your drop, and kind of things like that. Christianos, you discard cards and you call cards from drop, like that's its big thing. And all of them kind of do that. Dragon Empire, it's a little different, just getting straight criticals and retiring, but the retiring is the main aspect of like the Dragon Empire one. So they all kind of play towards a little bit of what the niche is of those nations. So it gives you a good sample of what those do. It kind of sucks that they're all vanillas, but I still kind of am out for debate on how I feel about it. I think it's nice because it gives a path for people to upgrade them. But when you're getting into the game, you don't know what cards to get, so it's a little tough sometimes. Yes, you can buy the packs and read the cards when you get them, but it's just an interesting one that they do throw one additional trigger and one upgraded PG in there to kind of get you that little bit of a taste of upgrading the deck straight out of the box, and it has a little bit of randomness with the ability to get the Elementaria. So for $15 in a deck box, it's not too bad.
Yeah, it's a lot of nothing, I guess, is like the best way to put it. So, because you get like the box, you get the energy generator, which is very important these days, and you get sleeves, which is nice. So you really only need so much to get so far now, and what standard started with as far as beginner product was MSRP $4 startup trial decks, or just, I think they're just called start decks, and they fed very cleanly into the anime. They followed like the main characters of Overdress, and they gave you what those decks did exactly. And these decks now, some of them do show up in the anime, but for the most part they are pretty self-contained in what they are, and they own like you only really get to see what they offer through their boss unit, and you kind of have to seek out cards from Divine's boosters starting from set 1, and not really needing to pay too much attention to anything before that to like thoroughly upgrade them and see what they're fully about. Because like with the Brandgate one, you wouldn't really know that Brandgate has much to do with set orders until you find his set order that can like buff the units he stands and stuff, and that's it's I don't know, like you kind of said yourself, I'm very mixed on it. I think in a vacuum, not a bad way to execute a starter product at all. I think it really tries to capture very, very partially the audience of people who just like don't play card games and maybe just watch like the anime or just watch anime in general, and just aren't used to stuff like that. Because having just vanillas as the cards is it doesn't ask much, if anything, of you, and it doesn't really teach you too much beyond like the very basic game mechanics, and I think that's a good thing. Like, whether you're giving somebody a deck to try and you say, oh, just ignore all the effects for now, just here are these game mechanics that you need to do to get through a game, and being like, okay, now that we're midway through the game and you look a bit more comfortable with it, let's add like counter blasts and soul blasts and stuff like that. This kind of like does that for you, but it doesn't really offer you the second half of that, which you could do with a deck that already has effects. So it's weird. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, as a person who's been playing the game for a long time, it's easy to say, oh yeah, it's super easy to upgrade these decks. But as a new player, you know, obviously I can't say it because I'm not in that position, but I feel like it may be a little daunting because it's like, well, I just spent $15 on this. Like, you buy a trial deck for Magic or anything, they may be a little bit more expensive, but you have a full deck you can play right then and there. Like, you can learn different keywords, effects, all those kinds of things in the decks. But still don't have to do a whole lot to upgrade it to have it fully playable. And yes, technically with the vanillas you can just be vanilla, but again, like Branky being the biggest detriment of having the vanillas in the deck is not having the set order. Like, not having any, even if it was just like a simple set order, like even if it was a one of in the deck, like something that you see it once and you can explain what it does in the trial deck, like, would have been nice, I think. But that's so tough because then they have to balance it through the other ones. But also at the same time, it is kind of nice, like I said, because it does give that excitement to be able to upgrade it and kind of stylize the deck towards what you want. With now there being 3 sets out of full support for these decks, like there's plenty of rounds of support. Like, you can fully isolate this deck to a actually pretty decent deck from just support that is targeting towards the name of whatever the boss unit is. It's hard to say to complain about it because it is very cheap to upgrade. Like, it's gonna cost you a couple bucks, and like, honestly, most of the time it's probably gonna be shipping that's gonna get you on some of this, like even ordering through TCG Player or anything. Like, it's pennies on the dollar for some of the cards because they're just printed in bulk. So yes, you can go and just do the pack route where you can open it and try to get some of them. That is the downside to having double rares and triple rares in the trial decks, because those are, you know, less printed in those packs, so it's a little more hard to get them versus where you'll see the commons all the time. So
yeah, it's I think at the end of the day, if you just look up what cards reference your boss unit, you can probably finish your deck as far as what support like directly focuses on that boss for like another maybe $15 at most, maybe before, maybe even after shipping, depending on. So you're spending what is essentially $30 on a deck you built yourself in a way that you just kind of followed the blueprint of based on your boss. And I think that's a really, really, really cool way to ease somebody into doing something like that. Now, I'm not going to say that it's like that it like justifies vanilla, because I think you could get the same thing with a trial deck that has like random cards that like, oh, they soul blast 2 to give something 5k, or they counter blast to draw a card on place or whatever, like stuff like that. Like, I think you can very easily teach new players more with the product you're selling them by just including that stuff to begin with. But I just never want, because this is the gateway to Vanguard right now, is these startup trial decks. Like, these are what you're gonna see when somebody shows you the game. They're gonna mention like, yeah, the cards don't have any effects on them, so you might need to like upgrade them when you get them, but like, this is how you get into the game, and it's got the energy generator and stuff. So like, it's, for what it is, it's not anything that should stop somebody from getting into the game, I think, especially if you already have a scene around you that plays. Obviously, if you don't have a scene, you're probably ordering singles anyway to build up a deck. So
yeah, and building on that, like, luckily, wherever you're buying Vanguard cards in a local game store, there's probably some sort of actual tournament going on there. Not a lot of stores that carry Vanguard that don't have a tournament. At least in our area, you know, that could be very different around the country. But it's in reality, having the vanillas isn't always a bad thing. Because like I know, we had a kid at our card shop. He's played Vanguard before, but he sold off a couple of his decks and wanted to rebuild the Service Cell deck, but didn't have any of the like commons or anything for it. And I had plenty of extras of them from opening up a full case. So we just said, all right, I'll run to my house and grab some for him. So I just came back home, got in the bulk, grabbed extras, and took it to him. And he had a full deck of all the commons. I was missing a couple double rares and triple rares since they were already being in use, but for the most part, he had what he needed to build the deck out like that day. So for $15, and it cost me less than $1 in bulk, like that's not uncommon that people are willing to give those kinds of cards out because they're not good in any other decks other than the deck specific for that boss unit. But at least in our run-ins, most people are very generous and are wanting to get people into the game. So it's there's a great community to help build and learn that building mechanic of the decks, and as well as helping out getting those pieces type thing.
Yeah, and it's definitely also very important to keep in mind that these aren't the only products that you can buy to get into the game. So the startup, what were they called? The stand-up deck sets, I think is what they call it. Yeah, for Orphist and Graham Grace and Favrenio, like those decks, while they might be a little behind as far as like the power level of them, they are offering a lot more to a new player who is probably pretty familiar with card games already, enough to know that like one of those bosses on that box like spoke to them and they liked what they were getting for the $50 or so it costs. Like it is more than a startup trial deck, but it gives you a really good start to the game. And with all of them, they have a playstyle that can like really give you a lot of like player expression, especially with how you want to go towards it. Like Orphis is a great example. You can stick with just like the Regis build and get some of like older set 6 stuff and set 8, I would want to say, yeah, something like that. Or you could get into the math stuff and try to see what you can do with that. And especially because I think you could get to 50 cards in the main deck with those, because they have the little 5 extra cards that come with them. Yeah. So you can definitely have a playable deck out of the box with those and just have a fine time. Like maybe the Favrenio one's kind of rough, but that's mostly because, if anything, one of the other cards you would need a playset of, they just only give you one, and that's probably the only one that's like kind of annoying, but you just got to order 3 more copies of a card that's in there. But at least like the deck is playable, and it's not like the worst thing ever,
Yeah, and it leaves it up to a little bit of variety. It gives you that kind of sampling of the one of, so you can decide if it's worth spending the money on, which Brainwash Twiller just is. So in that example,
I was referring to the grade 3.
Oh, that one
too. They give you
yeah.
only one of for some reason. I don't.
Yeah, the Persona Ride one. Yeah, that one was also a requirement. But either way, yeah, there's those as well as the Stride deck sets, which a lot of those are kind of geared more towards players from the G era of Vanguard, but also they're pretty much cookie cutter boxes. I mean, you open them, you can play them. They are competitive. There's little upgrades here and there that you can do. As well as just recently, there was new Strides actually announced that are coming out in set 6. So gives another path for newer players to look forward to upgrading the deck. I hope alongside that means there will be some more like normal unit support, but we'll see. Yes. It's not going to be the end of the world if not.
Yeah, I think out of all of these products we're talking about that a new player could buy getting into it, like obviously the Stride decks are the most expensive ones, but you are definitely getting a deck that will like stand the test of time. You really don't need to update them much, if at all, except for maybe one of them that recently got maybe hit on a ban list. But overall, they do so much for like getting a new player into the game, especially if you really like the idea of Strides and you really want something that feels really safe to bring to any locals because of like the crest power and having grade 4s and stuff like that. It's never felt bad to bring a Stride deck to a tournament, even the super old ones like Chronojet and Messiah. They still feel like fairly solid and like they can put up some sort of a fight, and that you have like a lot to learn and grow into with how the decks work, that you can spend a lot of time just playing them and probably get like a lot of value out of it.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that goes the same with all the decks. I mean, playing the game is the first step, and obviously getting a deck that you're going to enjoy playing in the meantime and adapting it, that's part of it. So, but if you're wanting to just focus more on that, then the Stride decks, that's kind of that way to go. I will just kind of circle back to the start decks. My biggest thing that I don't like about Vanguard is we don't really have a great way of saying, hey, here's deck lists that are fun and good, other than YouTube. YouTube's like the best, kind of method of showing like the trial decks. Like if you want to see what someone deck list, like Vanity Ezel's a good one, Kira Qualia, like there's people out there who make like videos on these things all the time. But outside of that, on like websites to see like deck lists and stuff, there are some websites, but none of them like official or affiliated. So you just kind of have to randomly search, and sometimes that's just dangerous to randomly search the internet. So but most of the time, deck lists that are posted are the ones that are topping in tournaments, and that's not always the fun decks. So building some of the older decks that aren't competitive currently, as well as even the start decks, you don't see a whole lot of tournament results with them, unfortunately, just because there are other decks that are being played. So it's one of my little downsides to the up and coming like Vanguard player, is that trying to learn about deck building and things like that, it's a little tough, but there are enough YouTube channels and things that do cover that kind of stuff, that it's not the end of the world.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I got into the game, I remember I didn't really know what. Well, it's not that I didn't know what I was doing. I just knew I really liked a Link Choker, so I just bought a ton of the Link Choker clan booster in G, and I built a Star Vader deck out of that. And that felt really nice. You can definitely still do something similar nowadays, depending on what you kind of want to go for. Like if you watch the anime and you really like the main character, or like Reziel in general, it's just like a boss unit or something, you can just try to build that by but if you're one of those people that will get into a game and just like buy boxes of product to start and then see like where you go from there, then yeah, like you can, oh man, I opened 2 Vargas and like a frame rare Varga or something out of 2 or 3 boxes or whatever. Let me just like finish this deck out. Let me build this because that's what I want to do, and apparently that's what the packs say I should be playing. I think it's just very important to understand, at least for people who are pretty familiar to the game, that this game to us probably feels really expensive. But I think if you're a new player and you really just build out 1 or maybe 2 decks and you're really just focused on those, like you're a fairly orthodox player as far as like engaging with card games, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I've got my deck. I've got my Vanguard deck. I play it at locals. Like you've got the 1 or maybe 2, like in case you want to spice it up every once in a while. But like other than that, like if you just do that, number one, there's just a lot of options for fairly cheap decks, and standard especially nowadays. There's a lot of really, really good, really strong budget options. And if you just keep it to that deck, you haven't really spent more than $100 on that deck, if I'm being honest. Like, yeah, you know.
I mean, obviously we've been in this game for a long time, and we have a lot of decks between us. I have 2 backpacks sitting behind me over here full of decks, and we don't talk about it, but there's a lot there. So yes, to us it can feel kind of expensive just because it is our main hobby. It's what we do, is like our big one is we play this card game. But as well, for someone getting into it, yes, the new player experience, it has ranges. Yes, you have your start decks. You have back to those startup trial decks with Graham Gaze, Favernail, and all, as well as the Stride deck. So there's all sorts of entry tiers essentially, and obviously you can buy decks online. You can go eBay, Facebook, all the above that have people who will walk you through building decks and things like that. Reddit's always got something going on. People help you with deck list. I mean, there's a lot of information out there and places you can go to get help with it, as well as always check your locals. I mean, that's the big thing, is talking to people and getting into a community of players is the biggest and best part about the game.
Yeah, it's at the end of the day, it's really important to remember that, like, we're not Pokemon, we're not Magic. Like, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that, like, you can't walk into a store and, like, you don't walk into a store and immediately know what Vanguard is and are familiar enough to be like, okay, who can somebody teach me how to play? Like, in that, like, Pokemon, like, most card shops, like, if not all of them, have that one night where they all play Pokemon, and it's really casual for them to, like, teach new people how to play if they want to, because, like, maybe they just collect the cards or whatever. But, like, it's Pokemon, like, everybody knows Pokemon. And with Magic, like, people are getting into Magic in, like, all sorts of ways now. Like, I work at a card shop now, and I recently had a conversation with a customer about how they really liked Lord of the Rings, and they saw all the Lord of the Rings cards, but they really wanted to learn how to play the game. And, like, stuff like that can bring you in. Now, obviously, with Vanguard, we have our wonderful anime, and that can definitely bring a lot of people in and keep people very invested in the game because of, like, what certain decks or certain cards can mean to them as far as how they engage with the anime. But yeah, it's just there's an expectation about it, I guess, is this is one of those card games where you do kind of have to not know what you're doing as you're getting into it, but understand that, like, not really knowing what's going on out of the jump is fine. Like, I think the best thing you can do is always just look at what just came out, like the most recent set or the most recent, like, pre-con or whatever, and just be like, okay, what's going on here, and then just spread out from that. Especially with, like, the Vergilla trial deck coming out in November, I want to say. That's a really good jumping off point, I think.
Yeah, I'm very excited for that. It's a little funny on timing, I think, just because of how both they released a lot of the grade 3 and ride line in set 2. Yeah. Then they're releasing a trial deck of it, which is a little funny. But the fact that they're releasing a whole core of cards that only come in that trial deck, and especially because there's a splits order in there that is ran all the time in Japan, in most decks anymore, that everyone is going to have to pick up one of. So it's going to make the deck very accessible and very, like, well, I say very accessible. It might be sold out in a lot of places, but it's going to be a good base deck because it kind of does just a little bit of everything as is. So super exciting that we are getting that deck. You know, just another trial deck is another fun part.
Yeah, and of course, always worth pointing out, we have made at least one video about currently accessible budget decks. That is worth checking out if you're getting into the game, especially if you've had some help from us from our other episodes. But just to, like, briefly, like, cover some, like, budget decks that have come out very recently. From, like, set 1, you have Chris Rain, actually. Chris Rain's, like, a weirdly cheap deck in that, like, it itself is very cheap, and most of its, like, targeted support is. There's, like, that one grade 2 that's, like, annoyingly, like, $15 or whatever. But as far as, like, getting a deck, like, I was like, oh, okay, I like the Lyrical Starter deck, but I'm not too big on, like, the lady in it, like, the main boss unit. But I really like...
This girl.
Yeah, I really like Mikoto in the anime, so I'm gonna try to build her deck, and, like, that's actually not too hard to do, and actually pretty accessible. And, you know, we can find an example for a deck in every set, which you could probably do real quick.
I mean, Mygo and Morphonica from set 1 are
Yeah,
also
that's
there.
right.
They're
Yeah.
they're decks that aren't necessarily part of the main niche, so they're going to be a little bit less supported. But kind of as base decks, they're kind of just all around pretty good. And they added a new kind of, not necessarily a new mechanic, but they have like specific rear guard circles and names that they have to have on board. So fun playstyle and pretty accessible and cheap. Um, I mean, in reality, all of the trial decks have support throughout those sets. Set 2 has a bunch. I mean, obviously, Blackmire's not itself, but you know.
I think between set 1 and set 2, if there's like a nation you really liked from the startup trial decks, but you're just not super feeling how basic their boss units are, like if you liked the Dark States one, Androld is a really cool like Dark States deck you can build out of set 1 and 2. And with Dragon Empire, you've got Grayandra. With Keter Sanctuary, you have Liel's kind of in the middle, but you know, there's definitely somewhere to go if you really like a certain nation. There's a lot of options in those nations, and you can definitely just try to fill out one of those, and then maybe spread out to another one if you're feeling it. But other than that, it's just not super hard in the grand scheme of things to find a deck you like, especially in Divines. I think they've given you like maybe too many options.
Yeah, I mean, all of the decks. I mean, obviously the very popular ones, Varga, Reziel, those kinds of things. They're a little bit more pricey in their own right. But even in set 3, Straw Haraja, Sacrifice Glass, Cody Blaze. I mean, all of those decks are actually all fairly cheap. I mean, 50 Cards is a shop that just released some of the startup decks. He had Straw Haraja, Cody Blaze. He had all 6 of like the main big bosses in it, and 3 of the decks were like $18.99. Like that's how cheap that at least was for them to give out with triggers and things. But then there was like Rotovisor, not Rotovisor, Dayusha, and Mordalian.
Yeah.
That were like $60 a piece, which even then still isn't all that bad. It's really 1 or 2 cards in the decks that are kind of pushing them to those points. But either way, as kind of jump-in points, they're good decks out of the box because they have most of their support built in with that set, and they're fairly cheap.
Yeah, because like when you really think about it, when you compare it especially to just like Magic, just Magic, like you know, people who get in the game now, they probably get in with Commander, and you know, an average precon for Commander is like $45-$50. You're spending about as much, if maybe a little bit more, on like a Vanguard deck that's like fully done. Like you might want to get maybe some generic cards they might want to try, or some Regalis pieces that kind of change how the deck plays, but from a core, the deck is perfectly playable from just how you built it out, going for its targeted support, that like you don't really need to touch it up that much, versus like a Commander deck where like once you get used to playing that Commander deck, you might want to upgrade it with some stuff that's come out in, you know, sets all across the game. And that's going to be sort of the case here. I think it really does depend. But a lot of the ones nowadays that come out in like set 3 and set 2, they actually don't, it's not that they don't care about generics, they're really just fine without them. Like Grayandra is just like the best example. He just does not need to run the grade 2 cycle energy card for Dragon Empire. It sure could, and it wouldn't hate it, but with how it's designed, it's just not something that you really need to worry about, honestly. Yeah. And I mean, I'd argue starting out, they're not really that necessary until you get into like that pretty competitive level in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, all of the decks, it really in set 2 and 3. Set 1's kind of a different, because that was the whole coming to Divines. But set 2 and 3, set 3 really are very isolated decks to their full system being in that one set. So buying in just individual boxes and things of those, you will get pieces left and right. And you don't have to worry about a whole thing. I mean, obviously, There are spaces for you to add in other generics and things, but not required. I mean, Undercover for Mordalion, it has all of the cards. You could literally run your entire 50 cards of, other than your triggers and things, being your Undercover units, and that's what you want. You want those named units, so running those from the set is what you want. So
Yeah, and what is it? At the end of the day, like, those generic cards might not necessarily teach you how to play that deck as in a specific sense. At the end of the day, you should go for those generic cards once you've gotten really comfortable with your deck and playing the game in general, because for the most part, these generic cards are just ways to generate like raw value, like guarding, you CB1 and you draw a card. Like, that's just replacing the card you guard with. Is that good? Yes. Is that like intrinsic to like playing Vanguard or your deck? Definitely not. So it's not like you need it out the gate when you build a deck for this game. It's not like a staple. It's not like a staple in the sense of like a Yu-Gi-Oh! Staples. Like, really the only staples that can be argued for is like effect triggers and the special PGs that can be easier.
Elementary, yeah, and sometimes you can say the Regalis pieces as well, but those are so, like, obviously as one-ofs in the decks, it's you don't have to run them, and a lot of the times one Regalis piece isn't good in a deck, but another one is, so like, you know, it doesn't hurt to get them, but also getting into it, stick with what the deck kind of wants to do, learn how the deck goes, and then you can find out which pieces you're using less or which ones are less effective, and then you can start looking at replacing those. So, but
yeah, all this to say, I think Vanguard is in a pretty interesting spot. Obviously, this isn't like the heyday of Standard just starting and everybody's at the same level and everybody has to deal with one of these 5 starter decks and what gets supported in sets for those, and waiting for new decks to come out that maybe target some niches more. Like, we're in a point of the game where there is an overwhelming amount of options, which is both a little intimidating maybe for new players, but it also it's like almost a guarantee that you're gonna find a deck that really speaks to you, and probably won't even be that expensive to pick up. But if it's but obviously there are some people who, like, the expense really doesn't matter to them. They just really enjoy the like play style of the game or the aesthetic, and they're just like, okay, I don't care that Red Isle's expensive. Like that, like we know people like that. Like, oh, I don't care that Red Isle's expensive. I'm just gonna build it because I've opened some packs and I've gotten a copy of him or something, and it's like he's cool, I guess, and this is my deck. This is my one Vanguard deck, and it works out really well for them. So
yeah, one of our buddies, this was obviously a while back, was getting into the card game. He had showed up at the card shop. He had collected cards himself, but never really got to play against other people. Finally started doing it, and after like 3 or 4 weeks of showing up to locals, he's like, all right, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna buy Youthberg. And at that time, when Youthberg when he was going to buy it, it was a $500 deck, and he said, all right, put it on my credit card and we're gonna go buy it right now. And then obviously he did, and still plays it to this day and absolutely loves it and runs it all the time. So it was worth it for him because that's what the style of game he wanted to play, and that's what he wanted to play. So
yeah, and even then, that's like a complete outlier. Like a Youthberg, even now being as expensive as it is, there are it's like maybe the best and worst thing about the current standard is that, like, oh, there's so many decks that are so powerful that, like, one deck you don't know anything about can just, like, kind of blindside you if you don't know how to play around it or whatever. And it's like it can be kind of swingy in that sense, I guess, but in my perspective, I think it's only a good thing because you just have so much to learn and enjoy and discover when you go up against a deck and you have no idea how it works. Most of the time you're going to end up being pretty surprised by how it kind of bends the rules to do what it does, and I think that's like probably one of the more enjoyable parts about the game, especially to a new player or somebody who doesn't play much. There's always that deck I show people that's like, okay, this card is going to reveal the top 7 cards of my deck, and if they're all different names, I'm gonna call one of them or write a copy of my Vanguard if it's there, and I'm just gonna do this infinitely. Is it like good or particularly like strong? Maybe sometimes, but at the end of the day, it's just kind of like janky and fun, and like that's what you're gonna see all the time if you're a new player, because there's so many different kinds of crazy decks now.
When I introduce people to the game, I always tell them, look, here's the rules of the game. Now, every rule that you've just learned also has an exception in a deck. So, whatever, if it's A is the exact rule, there's always a B that breaks that exact rule. So, don't be surprised if someone does something that way, but it has to be read on the card. So, it's one of those, here's how the game should be played, and then here's what this deck does specifically. Like, the biggest one is everyone dies at 6 damage. Except for Greedon. Greedon says, you know what? It's 7. I'm going to die at 7. So, little things like that are always, there's exceptions to everything. So, be understanding of that and be cognizant, but enjoy the game. That's the best, like the biggest part of it. Play the game, enjoy it, learn what breaks it and learn what doesn't break it, and learn all the little things about it, because there's so much to the game. And the best part about playing multiple decks and learning about new decks is you get to change up your game style to play against that type of deck. So it makes you try new things with what you have limited already.
Yeah, and that might be like a lot for a new player, I guess. But if this is something you're really committed into getting into, or you just need a hobby that can, you know, kind of tie into your like love of anime, maybe, it can really do that. It really can. It's probably the best one, I think, nowadays that can do that, given not the like bad state that Yu-Gi-Oh is in, but the very interesting state that a game like a Yu-Gi-Oh is in, you know, or like
and
Digimon
Yu-Gi-Oh being done, so that doesn't help either.
Yeah, so
as an anime, so
well, yeah, give us Rush Duel, Konami. Anyway, I think that'll do it for this one. We could go on, I think, forever about how much a new player can discover. But at the very least, if you discovered this channel, you should subscribe to it, because then you can see all the other videos we've got coming up that can maybe help you as a new player get used to the game. And especially if this video helped you a lot, you should like it, and leave us a comment of like how you got into the game, maybe if you're pretty new, or what experience you might have had helping somebody else to get into the game, because that's always pretty interesting to hear about. And you got to make sure you ring that bell to make sure you get notifications about when we upload and stuff. But until the next one, I was Cole,
and I was Trey,
and we'll see you later.